Reddit, what conversation with a stranger left you wondering if you had just talked to something not human or supernatural? I was on a hiking trip in the mountains a few years ago and stopped at a small, out-of-the-way lodge. There was this guy sitting by the fire, really old, but sharp as a tack. He started telling me all these stories about the area, how people would disappear in the woods and sometimes come back changed, like they weren't the same person anymore. He said, "The forest remembers you." I kind of laughed it off at the time, but when I asked him for his name before leaving, he just smiled and said, "Names don't last, but I will." I went back the next year, and the owner of the lodge had no idea who I was talking about. I've never been able to shake the feeling that he was something other. I was in this small town in the middle of nowhere, just passing through for work. I stopped at this diner for lunch, and the guy sitting next to me started talking about how the town had been waiting for me. I thought he was just messing with me, but then he mentioned something really specific about my past, like something only my closest friends would know. I got the chills and tried to brush it off. When I looked over again, he was just gone, like he vanished into thin air. I asked the waitress if she saw where he went, and she said, "Who?" There was no one sitting there. I'm still not sure what to make of it, but it felt like I was talking to something way beyond normal. I was visiting a cemetery late at night, don't ask, just a dumb teenage dare, and this guy in a long coat just appeared out of nowhere. He asked if I knew where the old ones were buried. I thought he meant some old section of the cemetery, but when I asked for clarification, he just said, "They're not buried in the ground, they walk in the dark." His voice was so strange, like multiple voices talking at once. I turned to ask my friend if she heard that, and when I turned back, he was gone. We left immediately, and I haven't gone back since. I once had this conversation with a woman on the subway who asked if I believed in reincarnation. I said I hadn't really thought about it. And she smiled this really unnerving smile and said, "You've lived before and you'll live again, but not like this." Then she told me about past lives I supposedly had, describing places and events I'd never heard of, but somehow felt familiar. After she got off the train, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just some random stranger. It felt more like I'd talked to some kind of ancient being, and it haunted me for weeks afterward. There was this homeless guy I used to see near my office every day. One day I stopped to give him some change, and he looked me dead in the eyes and said, "You will need to come by here again." He sounded so calm, almost peaceful. The next day, he was gone. I asked around, but no one had seen him leave or knew where he went. It wasn't just that he was gone, it felt like he had never existed, like he just dissolved out of reality. I was out late one night, just walking through my neighborhood, when this little girl, probably no older than 8 or 9, came up to me out of nowhere. She asked if I could help her find her mother. I asked where her mom was, and she pointed toward this dark alley. Something in my gut told me not to follow her, so I said no. She just stared at me for a long time before saying, "You were wise not to follow. She isn't my mother." Then she turned and walked into the alley and disappeared. I still have no idea what that was, but I'm glad I didn't go after her. I was working an overnight shift at a hotel, and this man walked in around 3 a.m. He didn't say much, just asked for a room, but his voice didn't sound right. It was too deep, almost like it was coming from somewhere else. When I gave him the key, his hand was ice cold, like holding something dead. He didn't have any luggage, just walked up to the room. The next morning, the room was empty. No one had checked out, and the cameras didn't show anyone leaving. I can't explain it, but I know I didn't imagine him. One summer, my family and I were on vacation in this really remote beach town. We rented a small house near the water, and on our first night there, this really tall man with silver hair came up to us and started talking about the tides, how they never really stop moving, even when the sea looks calm. His voice was hypnotic, like it was pulling me in. He talked to us for a while, but I noticed something weird. No matter how windy it got, his hair never moved. I thought I was imagining things, but when he left, my brother said, "That guy didn't have a shadow." We never saw him again, but I still think about that strange encounter. I used to work at a small bookstore, and one evening just before closing, a man came in. He didn't look at the shelves, just stared at me with this weird, blank expression. Finally, he said, "You know too much." Then he left. It was the creepiest thing because I'd been reading up on occult stuff that week. I have no idea how he could have known that, but the whole thing left me feeling unsettled for days. I started wondering if I had somehow attracted something, or if that guy was even human. A few years ago, I was on a night bus heading back home from a party. There was this guy who sat next to me, even though the bus was practically empty. He started asking weird questions like, "Do you believe in fate?" And have you ever seen your own future? I tried to brush him off, but then he said, you don't need to worry about your accident, you'll survive. I hadn't been in an accident, but 2 weeks later, I was in a car crash that should have been way worse than it was. I walked away with barely a scratch, but I still think about that guy and wonder how he knew. I once had a conversation with a street vendor who was selling these little trinkets. He handed me a small charm and said, you'll need this when the shadows come for you. I thought he was just trying to make a sale, but his tone was dead serious. A few nights later, I had the worst nightmare of my life, like I was being chased by these shadowy figures. I still have the charm, and I don't know if it actually means anything, but I can't bring myself to get rid of it. I was in a gas station late at night, and there was this man at the counter just staring at the clerk. He didn't say anything for what felt like minutes, then suddenly turned to me and said, you're not supposed to be here. I asked him what he meant, and he just smiled and left. No car, no nothing, he just walked off into the dark. The weirdest part, when I asked the clerk about him, she said she hadn't seen anyone. I used to live in a small town where nothing much happened. One day, I was walking through the park when this old man sitting on a bench said, the sky will fall, and you won't be ready. I asked him what he meant, but he just repeated, you won't be ready. I laughed it off and walked away, but a few weeks later, there was a massive storm that tore through the area, causing a lot of destruction. It's probably just a coincidence, but I've always wondered if he knew something no one else did. I was driving late at night on a country road, no other cars in sight, when I saw this hitchhiker. I pulled over to ask if he needed help, and he got in the car without saying a word. I asked him where he was heading, and he just pointed straight ahead. After a few minutes, he finally spoke, saying, you'll drop me off at the crossroads. I asked which crossroads, but he just stared out the window. When I finally got to the nearest intersection, I turned to ask if this was it, but he was gone. No way he could have gotten out without me noticing. I was once sitting at a bus stop when a guy came up to me and started talking about the old ways, saying how the modern world had forgotten the truth of things. He spoke like he wasn't from this time, like he was remembering something long forgotten. I tried to engage, but his eyes were so piercing, I felt like he could see right through me. When my bus came, he just said, the world will forget you too, and walked away. I've never felt so creeped out in my life. I was in an elevator late one night, going up to my apartment, when a guy stepped in at the last second. But he didn't press any buttons, just stood there staring straight ahead. After a few floors, he suddenly turned to me and said, you shouldn't go home tonight. The way he said, it was so calm, but it sent a chill down my spine. I got off at the next floor, completely freaked out. I still wonder what might have happened if I hadn't listened to him. So I was working at a hotel front desk on the night shift. This man came in and asked for a room, but his eyes were wrong. They were all black, no whites at all. I tried to stay calm and give him a room, but he just smiled and said, I won't need it long. After he left, I checked the cameras later and couldn't find any footage of him coming in or leaving. It still haunts me. I was once approached by a homeless woman who asked me for some change. I gave her a couple of bucks, and she grabbed my hand and said, you'll never die, not in the way you think. Her eyes were milky white, almost like she was blind, but her grip was incredibly strong. I pulled away and walked off as quickly as I could. To this day, I don't know what she meant by that, but I can't forget it. I met a guy at a party once who was super charismatic, but also just off. He kept making these weird comments about how we were all just playing our roles and how none of this is real. At one point, he looked directly at me and said, you've played this game before, haven't you? I laughed it off, but something about his tone made it feel like he knew something I didn't. I left the party early that night and never saw him again. I was driving through the desert late at night when I saw a man standing on the side of the road. I pulled over to ask if he needed help, but when I rolled down the window, he said, I've been waiting for you. I didn't recognize him, and when I asked what he meant, he just smiled and said, you'll see soon enough. I got out of there as fast as I could, but the way he said it still gives me chills. I used to work at a bar, and one night this woman came in who looked totally normal at first, but when I went to take her order, she looked at me and said, you're not supposed to be here. I asked what she meant, and she just smiled this really creepy smile and said, you'll know soon. She left before I could say anything else, and I haven't stopped thinking about that encounter since. I was once on a train late at night when a man sat down across from me. He didn't say anything for the longest time, just stared at me. Then, out of nowhere, he said, you've been marked. I asked him what he meant, and he just stood up and walked away. I didn't see him get off the train, and when I asked the conductor about him, he said no one else had been sitting near me. It freaked me out so much that I changed my route home for weeks. I was in a hospital waiting room, and this old man came up to me and asked if I knew what day it was. Dre told him, and he smiled and said, "That's the day I die every year." I laughed, thinking it was just a weird joke, but when I looked back up, he was gone. The receptionist said no one like that had been in the waiting room. I still think about it every time that date rolls around. I used to work at a gas station off a highway in the middle of nowhere. One night, this woman came in, drenched from head to toe, even though it wasn't raining. She looked right at me and said, "He's coming for you." I asked who she meant, but she just walked out into the dark. I ran outside to look for her, but she was gone. I quit that job soon after. I was hiking alone in the woods when I saw this man standing in the middle of the trail, just staring at me. I asked if he needed help, but he didn't say anything, just kept staring. Then he said, "You shouldn't have come this way." I turned around to go back, and when I looked behind me again, he was gone. I don't know what that was, but it made me feel like I wasn't supposed to be there. I was in a grocery store when an older woman walked up to me and asked if I knew where the veil was. I assumed she meant something in the store, but she looked at me dead serious and said, "It's getting thinner, you know." I laughed awkwardly and walked away, but something about her tone still creeps me out. It felt like she was talking about something far more sinister. I had a conversation with a guy at a bar who told me that he'd seen beyond the veil. I thought he was just drunk, but he started describing places that didn't sound like anywhere on Earth. He said, "The things that live there don't care about us, but sometimes they look." The way he said it was so matter of fact, like he had actually been there. I left as soon as I could, but I still think about what he said. I was working as a delivery driver one night when I dropped off a pizza at this really rundown house. The guy who answered the door looked completely normal, but as I handed him the pizza, he said, "You'll be back sooner than you think." I didn't think much of it at the time, but a week later I had to deliver to the same house again. The problem? No one had ordered anything. I never went back. I was walking through a park one evening when a little boy came up to me and asked if I knew where his parents were. I said no, and he just stared at me with these huge, dark eyes and said, "They're coming for you." He ran off before I could ask anything else, and I never saw him again. I still don't know if it was just some weird kid or something more, but it freaked me out. I was staying at a motel in the middle of nowhere, and late at night, the manager knocked on my door. He asked if I needed anything and mentioned that the watchers had been asking about me. I didn't understand what he meant, but his eyes had this weird glow in the dark. I locked my door and didn't leave the room until morning. When I checked out, the day manager didn't know anything about the guy who came to my door. I was once waiting at a bus stop when a man came up and sat next to me. He didn't say anything for a long time, then suddenly turned to me and said, "They're watching you." You know, I asked who he meant, but he just stood up and walked away. I didn't see him get on any buses or go anywhere else. It was like he just disappeared into thin air. I used to work at a gas station, and one night a woman came in who looked like she was from another time. Her clothes were all old-fashioned. She asked for directions to a place I'd never heard of and then said, "You won't find it on any map." She left before I could ask more, and when I checked the cameras later, there was no footage of her coming in or leaving. I had a conversation with a guy in a coffee shop who seemed really off. He kept saying that we were all just players in a game, and when I tried to ask him what he meant, he leaned in and said, "You'll know soon." I laughed it off at the time, but a few months later, I had a near-death experience that made me question everything. I still wonder if he knew something I didn't. So I was in a laundromat late one night, and this man came in and sat down across from me. He didn't have any laundry with him, just sat there watching me. After a few minutes, he said, "You're not where you're supposed to be." And I asked him what he meant, but he didn't respond. When I looked up again, he was gone. I checked the cameras later, and there was no footage of him entering or leaving. I was on a long road trip, and during a rest stop, a man approached me and asked if I knew the way back. I assumed he meant back to the highway, but when I pointed him in the right direction, he just laughed and said, "Not that way. You don't know the way." He walked off into the woods, and I never saw him again. I was on the subway late one night when an old man sat across from me and just stared for what felt like forever. Finally, he leaned forward and said, "You're not supposed to be here." I asked him what he meant, but he just smiled and got off at the next stop. I was left sitting there, completely freaked out. It felt like he knew something about me that I didn't. I was walking my dog at dusk in a park when a little girl came up to me and asked, "Have you seen my mother?" I looked around, didn't see anyone, and asked her where she last saw her. The girl just pointed at the trees and said, "She's hiding." It gave me goosebumps. I asked if she wanted me to help, but she shook her head and ran off. I never saw her again, and I still wonder what that was all about. I was working the graveyard shift at a gas station when this guy walked in. He didn't buy anything, just stood there and said, "They're watching you right now." I laughed awkwardly and looked around, but no one else was there. He didn't explain, just smiled and walked out. I spent the rest of the night constantly checking the security cameras, completely freaked out. One night, I had a knock on my door from a random guy saying he needed to use the phone because his car broke down. I didn't have a good feeling about it, so I told him no. He gave me this weird smile and said, that was the right choice. Then he turned around and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. To this day, I'm still creeped out by what he said. I used to work in a hotel, and one night a guest came to the front desk, looking completely shaken. He said he had been asleep when someone whispered in his ear, "You should leave, now." He was the only one in the room, and the door was still locked. He checked out immediately, and honestly, I don't blame him. The way he described it, it gave me chills. I was in a museum, looking at a really old painting when this woman standing next to me whispered, "He's still here, you know." I assumed she was talking about the artist, but when I looked over, she was staring right at me with a serious expression. I walked away quickly, feeling really unsettled. It wasn't until later that I realized the painting was of some guy who was rumored to haunt the museum. I was at the beach late at night, and this older woman walked up to me out of nowhere and said, "Don't go in the water tonight." I wasn't even planning on it, but something about the way she said it gave me chills. She just walked off without saying anything else, and I ended up leaving the beach entirely. I still think about what would have happened if I had ignored her warning. I was in a small antique store, and the owner came up to me as I was looking at this old mirror. He told me, "You should put that down. It doesn't like new owners." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but his face was dead serious. Needless to say, I didn't buy the mirror, and I've never been back to that shop since. The whole thing just gave me the creeps. I had a conversation with a guy at a party who casually mentioned that he used to be someone else. I asked him what he meant, thinking he was talking about a career change or something, but he just smiled and said, "You wouldn't understand." The way he said it, it felt like he wasn't talking about a job. It still weirds me out thinking about it. I was walking through an old part of town when a man came up to me and said, "You've walked this path before, many times." I told him it was my first time there, but he just smiled and said, "Not in this life." Then he turned and walked away. I still get chills thinking about that encounter. It was like he knew something I didn't, and I didn't stick around to ask. I was at a hospital visiting a friend when an elderly woman approached me in the hallway. She smiled and said, "You're not meant to be here yet." I laughed it off at the time, thinking she was just confused, but it wasn't until I got home that the full weight of what she said hit me. It still sends a shiver down my spine when I think about it. I was driving through the middle of nowhere when I stopped at a roadside diner. An old man sitting in the corner looked at me as I walked in and said, "You're too early." I didn't know what he meant, so I just ignored it and got my food. When I left, I looked back at the diner from the road, and it was completely dark and empty. Still not sure what happened that night. I once met a guy who told me he could see the things no one else could. I asked him what he meant, and he said, "There are shadows that follow you everywhere, and no one notices." It gave me the creeps, but the weird part is, after he said that, I started noticing weird things out of the corner of my eye for weeks after. Shadows, figures, but when I looked, nothing was there. And I was once in a thrift shop looking through old records when the shop owner came up to me and said, "Don't touch that one. It's cursed." I thought he was joking, but he was completely serious. I left without buying anything because the whole vibe in that place was just off. Something about the way he said it gave me the chills. I was waiting at a bus stop when a man walked up to me and said, "You won't make it." I asked him what he meant, but he just smiled and said, "You'll see." Then he walked away. I took an Uber home instead of waiting for the bus, and nothing happened, but that encounter still haunts me. What did he mean by that? I was working in a grocery store and a customer came through my line. As I handed him his receipt, he looked me dead in the eyes and said, "This is your last day here, isn't it?" I hadn't told anyone I was quitting, and when I asked him how he knew, he just smiled and left. I still don't know how he could have known that. I was at a park when a kid came up to me and asked if I had seen the man in the trees. I thought he was talking about a park ranger or something, but when I looked around, no one was there. The kid just smiled and ran off. I spent the rest of my walk feeling like I was being watched, so that place has never felt the same to me since. I was staying at a bed and breakfast in a small town when I ran into an older woman in the hallway. She smiled at me and said, "You won't want to stay here long." When I asked her what she meant, she just said, "You'll see." I checked out early the next day because something about the whole place just felt wrong. I was sitting on a park bench when a man came up to me and said, "It's almost time." I asked him what he was talking about, but he just smiled and walked away. To this day, I have no idea what he meant, but I left the park immediately and haven't been back since. I was in a small, old bookstore when the owner came up to me and said, "You shouldn't be here today." I asked him what he meant, but he didn't say anything else, just stared at me until I left. It was one of the creepiest interactions I've ever had, and I still think about it whenever I walk by that shop. I was waiting in line at a fast food place when the guy behind me suddenly leaned in and whispered, "You've been here before, haven't you?" I hadn't been, so I told him no. He just nodded and said, "Not yet." I still don't know what he meant, but it gave me the chills, and I left without ordering. I was visiting a small, old chapel in a rural area when an elderly man approached me and said, "You can feel them, can't you?" I asked him what he was talking about, but he just smiled and said, "The ones who came before." It was such a weird encounter, and it left me feeling like the place was haunted or something. I was in an elevator when a man stepped in and said, "I didn't expect to see you here today." I had never seen him before, so I asked him what he meant, and he just smiled and said, "You will." He got off on the next floor, and I never saw him again. The whole thing felt so strange, like he knew something I didn't. I was out on a run when an older man stopped me and said, "You need to be careful around here." I asked him why, but he just smiled and said, "Things aren't what they seem." It freaked me out enough that I turned around and went home. I've avoided that path ever since. I was at a flea market when a woman selling old books told me, "That one's not for you." I asked her what she meant, and she said, "It wasn't meant for you." I put the book down and left. Something about her tone was just so unsettling. I was out walking late at night when a woman passed me and whispered, "They're watching you." I turned around to ask her what she meant, but she was already gone. I rushed home, and the whole walk back felt like something was following me. I never take that route anymore. I was sitting in a cafe when a man came up to me and said, "You've done this before." I asked him what he meant, and he said, "You always come here when it happens." Then he just walked away. The whole conversation made no sense, and it left me feeling really weird.